The morning of October 24th, 1944 broke grey and uncertain over the Philippine Sea. Aboard the carrier USS Essex, Commander David McCampbell stood on the flight deck as radar screens in the Combat Information Center flickered with ghostly green returns. 3 massive formations of Japanese aircraft were converging on the American fleet from altitudes ranging from 1,000 feet to 25,000 feet. The enemy was coming, and they were coming in force. McCampbell's Hellcat, Mincy 3, hadn't been scheduled to fly that morning. The fuel tanks were only half full when the loudspeaker crackled across the flight deck. All available pilots to their aircraft. Admiral Sherman himself had earlier forbidden McCampbell from flying dangerous sorties. As the Air Group commander and the Navy's most prominent living ace, he was considered too valuable to risk. But standing on that deck, watching the radar contacts multiply, McCampbell made a decision. He was available. He headed for his plane. Every battle tells a story, and every hero deserves to be remembered. Subscribe now and stand with us as we keep history alive. 7 Hellcats launched that morning from Essex, climbing hard into clouds that towered like white mountains over the Philippine Sea. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, pushed their throttles forward and pulled ahead of the formation. The Japanese strike force was only 22 miles away. There wasn't time for careful planning or perfect positioning. There was only the climb, the building clouds, and somewhere ahead, an enemy force that outnumbered them by orders of magnitude. At 30,000 feet, they broke through into brilliant sunshine, and there, spread across the sky like a swarm of insects, were more than 60 Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, bombers, all heading directly toward the American carriers below. To understand what happened in the 90 minutes that followed, you must first understand what had brought both sides to this moment. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not simply another naval engagement. It was Japan's last desperate gamble to stop the American advance through the Philippines. If the Philippines fell, Japan's empire would be cut in two, severing the flow of oil from the southern resource zone that kept the home island's war machine running. Everything depended on stopping the Americans at Leyte. But by October of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was fighting with one hand tied behind its back. 4 months earlier, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American pilots had shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. The engagement earned a nickname that would echo through naval aviation history, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It wasn't hyperbole, it was a slaughter. The Japanese lost not just aircraft, but something far more precious. Pilots. Trained, experienced pilots who had learned their craft over years of combat. Men who knew how to fight, how to survive, how to extract every advantage from their aircraft. By the time of Leyte Gulf, those men were mostly gone. The pilots climbing into their cockpits on October 24th had received, on average, just 3 months of training. 3 months to learn what American pilots spent 2 years mastering. 3 months to somehow become proficient enough to challenge American aviators who logged 600 hours of flight time before they ever saw combat, with 200 of those hours in frontline fighters. The mathematics of attrition had been brutal and unforgiving. At Coral Sea, at Midway, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, the cream of Japanese naval aviation had been systematically destroyed. These were not merely pilots lost. These were instructors who would never train the next generation. These were tactical innovators whose lessons died with them. By 1944, Japan's pilot training program had been reduced too, teaching young men little more than how to take off and how to steer. Advanced combat tactics, coordinated squadron maneuvers, energy management in dogfights, these skills took time to develop, time Japan no longer had. The aircraft themselves told a similar story. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been, in 1941 and 1942, perhaps the finest carrier fighter in the world. Light, maneuverable, with a range that astonished Allied intelligence analysts, it had swept Allied opposition from the skies over the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Japanese pilots spoke of it with reverence. It could outturn anything America fielded. It could outclimb most opponents. And in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was absolutely deadly. But the Zero had been designed for a different war. A war where Japan's opening strikes would cripple Allied air power, where skilled pilots would rack up kills against inferior opposition, where the conflict would be decided in 6 months of brilliant victories. The Zero had been optimized for that war. Long range, extreme maneuverability, firepower concentrated in 2 20mm cannons and 2 smaller machine guns. What it did not have was armor. No armored pilot seat, no armored fuel tanks, no self-sealing fuel systems that could absorb bullet strikes and keep flying. The Zero's tanks were simple aluminum structures. A single burst of .50 caliber fire could ignite them, turning the entire aircraft into a flying torch. Pilots called them flying Zippos. The nickname wasn't affectionate. It was a statement of fact. This design philosophy made sense in 1941, when the Zero faced the lumbering American F4F Wildcat, an aircraft the Japanese dismissively called obese, like an old sumo wrestler. But by 1944, the opponent had changed. Grumman had listened to combat pilots like Edward Butch O'Hare, whose name would later grace Chicago's International Airport. Pilots who had fought Zeros, who had studied them, who understood their strengths, and could articulate exactly what America needed to beat them. The result was the F6F Hellcat. On paper, the specifications seemed modest. Top speed of 380 miles per hour compared to the Zero's 335. Climb rate slightly better at higher altitudes. Similar maneuverability at combat speeds. But the real differences weren't visible in performance charts. They were in the details that kept pilots alive. 2,000 horsepower from a Pratt & Whitney R2000 800 double Wasp engine, the same engine that powered the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt and the Navy's F-4U Corsair. That power translated into speed in the dive, acceleration out of trouble, and the ability to simply outrun an opponent when necessary. 6 50 caliber machine guns, each loaded with 400 rounds of ammunition. When all 6 fired simultaneously, they delivered 3,600 rounds per minute of firepower. The convergence pattern was tuned so that at 300 yards, all 6 streams of tracers and armor-piercing rounds intersected at a single point. Anything caught in that cone of fire simply disintegrated. But most importantly, the Hellcat was built to survive. Armor plating behind the pilot's seat, armor around the engine, self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple hits and keep functioning. The pilots who flew them knew they weren't climbing into the fastest or most agile fighter in the sky. They were climbing into an aircraft that would bring them home. An aircraft that could absorb punishment that would destroy a Zero and keep flying. American test pilots had flown captured Zeros, documenting their capabilities with scientific precision. The reports were distributed to every Hellcat squadron. Do not dogfight with a Zero. Do not try to follow it through loops or tight turns at low speed. Instead, use your advantages. Use your power. Use your speed. Use your ability to dive away faster than the Zero can follow. Attack from altitude, make your pass, and zoom back up before the Zero can react. Never slow down to fight on their terms. The tactics had names: boom and zoom, energy fighting. They were systematic, disciplined approaches to air combat that played to American strengths while negating Japanese advantages. They required patience, coordination, and the confidence to disengage when the situation turned unfavorable. Most importantly, they required training. The kind of training American pilots received in 18 to 24 months of intensive preparation. By 1942, the United States Naval Aviation Cadet Program was graduating nearly 11,000 pilots annually. By 1943, that number had doubled to more than 20,000. Each graduate had 600 hours of flight time. Each had trained on progressively more complex aircraft, from basic trainers to the actual fighters they would fly in combat. Each had practiced carrier landings, navigation, formation flying, gunnery, and combat tactics until these skills became instinctive. The pipeline was industrial in its efficiency. Pre-flight school, where cadets learned the theory of flight, navigation, and military discipline. Primary training in simple aircraft like the N3N biplane. Basic training in more powerful planes like the SNV, learning formation flying and instrument work. Advanced training in combat-type aircraft, learning gunnery and tactics. And finally, operational training in actual Hellcats, Corsairs, or Avengers, putting everything together before joining a squadron. The system was designed not to produce superb pilots, but to produce large numbers of competent pilots. Pilots who could follow doctrine, work as teams, and survive long enough to gain experience. It was, in essence, a recognition that this would be a war of attrition, and attrition required a steady supply of trained replacements. Japan had never built such a system. Pre-war Japanese naval aviation had been an elite force, selecting only the most talented candidates and training them intensively for years. The results were spectacular pilots who could perform feats of airmanship that left American aviators shaking their heads in disbelief. But there were never very many of them. When they died, they couldn't be replaced. Not with the industrial capacity stretched to its limits, not with the fuel supplies dwindling, not with the training bases under increasing threat from American air attacks. So by October 24, 1944, the young men climbing into Zeros over the Philippines had logged perhaps 3 months in training aircraft. Many had never seen combat. Some had barely practiced live-fire gunnery. They knew the basics of formation flying, the fundamentals of navigation. They understood, in theory, how to attack American ships. But theory and practice were separated by a chasm that no amount of courage could bridge. This was the context that morning as Commander David McCampbell and Ensign Roy Rushing climbed toward 30,000 feet. Below them, the 5 other Hellcats from Essex were positioning to attack the Japanese bombers. Above them, more than 40 Japanese fighters escorted the strike package toward the American fleet. McCampbell made a decision. He and Rushing would tackle the fighters. Alone, 2 against 40. The tactical situation was absurd on its face. Outnumbered 20-1, low on fuel before they even reached the fight, facing an enemy whose numerical advantage should have been overwhelming. But McCampbell had advantages the Japanese didn't. He had altitude. He had a faster aircraft. He had 2,000 rounds of ammunition. And he had Roy Rushing, a wingman who would follow him through 20 coordinated attacks over the next 90 minutes, without making a single error. Most importantly, he had training, years of it. Hundreds of hours flying the Hellcat, understanding its capabilities, learning its peculiarities. He knew exactly how fast he could dive without stressing the airframe. He knew precisely how much deflection to give a target at various angles and speeds. He knew how to manage his energy, trading altitude for speed and speed for position, conserving his options while denying them to his opponents. If you find this story engaging, drop a comment, share your thoughts, and let's honor the heroes together. The Japanese formation spread out below them in 3 neat Vs, a textbook attack formation. Professional, organized, exactly as they'd been trained. McCampbell rolled inverted and pulled through, diving toward the rightmost aircraft in the trailing formation. Roy Rushing followed, slightly behind and offset. Watching his leaders, the Hellcat shuddered as McCampbell pressed the trigger. 6 streams of 50 caliber tracers reached out across the sky, converging on the Zero. The Japanese fighter exploded in a bright flash, pieces tumbling away as it spiraled toward the ocean 5 miles below. Before the other Japanese pilots even registered what was happening, McCampbell and Rushing had already climbed back up, using their speed and power to regain altitude advantage. The Japanese formation began to break apart, pilots peeling off in confusion. Where had the attack come from? How many Americans were there? The formation that moments before had been a disciplined strike package now began to dissolve into individual aircraft, each pilot suddenly more concerned with survival than the mission. McCampbell didn't give them time to reorganize. He rolled into another attack, this time from a different angle, picking out a second zero on the left side of the formation. Fire. Hits registered along the fuselage. The Zero's fuel tanks ignited, and the aircraft fell away, trailing a black plume of smoke. Rushing called out his own target, dove, fired, and pulled back up. Another kill. For the Japanese pilots, the situation was, rapidly becoming a nightmare. They had been briefed on American fighters, warned about Hellcats, but nothing in their 3 months of training had prepared them for this. 2 enemy aircraft, attacking from altitude with systematic precision, disappearing before anyone could mount a counterattack, then reappearing seconds later from a completely different direction. The coordination between McCampbell and Rushing was surgical. Before each attack, McCampbell would call out which target he was taking right side or left side, which position in the formation. This told Rushing where McCampbell would dive and, critically, which direction he would pull out. It gave Rushing freedom to maneuver independently while knowing exactly where his leader would be. 20 times they repeated this sequence: dive, attack, climb, dive, attack, climb. Each time maintaining their altitude advantage. Each time using speed and power to dictate the terms of engagement. The Japanese pilots tried to fight back. Some attempted to turn into the attacks, using the Zero's superior maneuverability to bring their guns to bear. But McCampbell simply dove away, using gravity and his more powerful engine to accelerate beyond the Zero's ability to follow. By the time the Japanese pilot could reverse course, the Hellcat was already climbing back up, energy restored, ready for another pass. Others tried to chase the Americans, hoping to catch them in a climbing turn where the Zero's lighter weight might provide an advantage. But McCampbell and Rushing never allowed the fight to slow down. They maintained speed religiously, trading altitude for velocity when necessary, never permitting the combat to devolve into the kind of slow-speed turning fight where Japanese aircraft excelled. What the Japanese pilots were experiencing was the application of doctrine, not individual brilliance, though McCampbell possessed that in abundance. Not technological superiority alone, though the Hellcat's advantages were real. What they faced was the systematic application of training, tactics, and experience against an opponent who possessed none of these things in equal measure. McCampbell's marksmanship was devastating. His bursts were short, controlled, economical. He understood deflection shooting instinctively, leading his targets just enough to ensure his 6 streams of fire intersected with the enemy aircraft's flight path. Rushing later commented that McCampbell was far superior at aircraft recognition than he was, able to identify not just aircraft types, but specific variants from hundreds of yards away. This wasn't natural talent. It was the product of hundreds of hours studying recognition charts, watching training films, practicing until identification became automatic. The fight spread out across miles of sky. Individual Japanese aircraft tried to regroup, to form some kind of organized response. But every time they began to establish a formation, McCampbell or Rushing would dive through, breaking them apart again. The American tactic was deliberate. Keep the enemy scattered. Keep them reacting rather than planning. Deny them the opportunity to coordinate, to use their numbers effectively. Minutes stretched into a half hour. The half hour became 45 minutes. McCampbell's ammunition counters ticked downward. 6 guns, 400 rounds each, totaling 2,400 rounds. At 600 rounds per minute combined firing rate, that was 4 minutes of continuous fire. But no one fired continuously in combat. Short bursts, 2 seconds at most, make every burst count. One by one, Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. 7 zeros. 2 Oscars. Nakajima Ki 43 fighters that Army units used, distinguishable by their slightly different wing configuration. Each kill confirmed by Rushing, who stayed close enough to verify but far enough to maintain defensive vigilance. The Japanese pilots were brave. Some stayed in the fight far longer than tactical sense suggested, trying desperately to land a telling blow on the Americans who were systematically destroying their formation. But courage without training is insufficient. Several attempted head-on passes, flying straight at the Hellcats with guns firing. McCampbell simply rolled and dove, letting the Zero pass harmlessly overhead, then reversed and attacked from behind as the Japanese pilot tried to figure out where his opponent had gone. The vulnerability of the Zero became apparent with each engagement. A single solid burst was enough. The aircraft had no armor to stop the .50 caliber rounds from reaching critical components. The fuel tanks, unprotected and unsealed, turned even minor hits into catastrophic fires. Pilots who might have survived in a more robust aircraft instead fell burning toward the ocean, their parachutes never deploying because there wasn't time. This was the cruel reality the Japanese Navy faced by late 1944. Their fighter, once supreme, was now a death trap when matched against American firepower. They knew it. American intelligence reports from captured documents showed that Japanese pilots were acutely aware of their aircraft's deficiencies. They had requested armor, they had requested self-sealing tanks, but industrial capacity was finite, and Japan's had been stretched beyond breaking by years of war. The A6M5 variant that appeared in autumn of 1943 incorporated some improvements. Thicker wing skins that allowed slightly higher diving speeds, better protection for the pilot. But these modifications were incremental, not revolutionary. The fundamental design philosophy remained unchanged, and that philosophy was now fatally compromised. McCampbell glanced at his fuel gauge. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty. He'd taken off with tanks only half full, and the last 90 minutes of combat flying full-throttle climbs, high-speed dives, constant maneuvering had drained what little he had. His radio crackled. Essex's flight deck was fouled with aircraft launching for another strike. He couldn't land aboard his own carrier even if he made it back. The decision point was simple. Continue fighting and risk ditching in the ocean miles from rescue, or break off now and hope the fuel lasted until he found a deck. McCampbell looked around the sky. The Japanese formation, what remained of it, was scattered and disorganized. The bombers had turned back, their mission aborted. The fighters that survived were fleeing westward toward Philippine airfields. The mission was accomplished. The American carriers were safe. He and Rushing had broken up an attack by 60 aircraft with just 2 Hellcats. He'd shot down 9 enemy aircraft. Rushing had claimed 6 more. 15 kills between 2 pilots in a single mission, a record that would never be equaled in US Navy history. But the fight wasn't quite over. As McCampbell and Rushing turned eastward toward the American fleet, their ordeal took an almost farcical turn. Approaching the task force, the formation's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, not at Japanese aircraft, at them. 5-inch shells began detonating around the 2 Hellcats, close enough that McCampbell could feel the concussion waves buffeting his aircraft. He descended to wave-top level, jinking violently from side to side, using precious fuel in violent maneuvers to avoid being shot down by his own side. Several American fighters joined the anti-aircraft guns, diving down on the 2 lone Hellcats, apparently mistaking them for Japanese aircraft. At the last moment, the very last moment, recognition occurred. The friendly fighters broke off. The anti-aircraft fire ceased. McCampbell's fuel gauge now read empty. The engine was running on fumes. Essex's deck was still fouled. He looked for alternatives and spotted the escort carrier USS Langley. Smaller, more lightly built than the Essex-class fleet carriers, but it had a clear deck. He radioed his intention to land. Permission granted. The Hellcat's wheels touched the Langley's deck. McCampbell rolled out and throttled back. The engine coughed once, sputtered, and died. Not mechanical failure, simple physics. The fuel tanks were completely dry. Ground crew rushed to the aircraft, intending to restart the engine and move it forward to clear the landing area for rushing. They couldn't. There was literally no fuel left to start the engine. They had to physically push the Hellcat out of the way. Rushing landed moments later, his own fuel situation nearly as desperate. When armament crews examined McCampbell's aircraft, they made a discovery that left them shaking their heads. His ammunition counters read 6 rounds remaining, total, across all 6 guns. And all 6 rounds were jammed. He'd fought the last minutes of combat with weapons that would no longer fire, bluffing with maneuvers alone. The margin between success and catastrophe had been measured in seconds of fuel and single-digit ammunition counts. The entire engagement had balanced on the finest of edges. Had the Japanese pilots been more experienced, had they maintained formation discipline, had they possessed better training in energy tactics, the outcome might have been vastly different. 2 Hellcats, no matter how well flown, should not have been able to defeat 40 fighters. But they did defeat them. The reason was training. The reason was tactics. The reason was the systematic application of American industrial and doctrinal advantages against an opponent whose training program had collapsed under the weight of attrition. For the Japanese pilots who survived and made it back to their airfields, the experience was shattering. They had been told they were flying to attack American carriers, to damage the invasion fleet, to defend the Philippines. Instead, they'd been methodically destroyed by 2 enemy fighters who never gave them a chance to use their numerical advantage. Some pilots landed with their aircraft riddled with bullet holes, having narrowly escaped, becoming McCampbell's 10th or 11th kill. Others never made it back at all, their aircraft shot down or so badly damaged they crashed trying to land. The statistics from that day told a story that Japanese commanders couldn't ignore. 60 aircraft had approached the American fleet. 15 had been shot down by just 2 Hellcats. More would be lost to other American fighters and anti-aircraft fire throughout the day. The strike accomplished nothing. Not a single bomb hit an American ship. The mission was a complete failure. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Across the multiple engagements of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, this pattern repeated. Japanese aircraft launched in large numbers, reached the combat area, and were systematically destroyed by smaller numbers of American fighters. The kill ratios were lopsided to the point of being difficult to believe. 10-1. Sometimes worse. This wasn't because Japanese pilots were cowards. Combat reports consistently noted their bravery, their willingness to press attacks even when facing overwhelming firepower. But bravery wasn't enough. The gap in training, in aircraft capability, in tactical doctrine, was simply too wide to bridge with courage alone. The American pilot training system, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, had solved the fundamental problem of attrition warfare. Lose a pilot, train a replacement. Lose 10 pilots, train 10 replacements. The pipeline never stopped. By late 1944, America was graduating more naval aviators per month than Japan could train in a year. Japanese industry, starved for resources and under increasing bombardment, couldn't match this production. The fuel shortage alone crippled training programs. Student pilots who should have received hundreds of hours of flight time instead received dozens. Advanced combat training was compressed or eliminated entirely. The result was young men who knew how to fly an aircraft but not how to fight in one. The doctrine made things worse. Japanese tactical doctrine, developed when their pilots were highly skilled, emphasized individual initiative and aggressive attacks. This worked brilliantly when pilots had the training to execute complex maneuvers and the experience to recognize when to break off attacks. But for inexperienced pilots, it was a recipe for disaster. They'd press attacks they should have abandoned, stay in fights they should have fled, and make decisions that veterans would have instantly recognized as fatal. American doctrine, by contrast, was conservative. Stay with your wingman, maintain altitude advantage, attack from positions of strength, break off if the situation deteriorates. These rules-based approaches didn't require exceptional skill or experience. They required discipline, which could be trained. A mediocre pilot following proper doctrine would beat a talented pilot making poor tactical decisions. This was the reality that McCampbell and Rushing demonstrated on October 24, 1944. Not that American pilots were inherently superior, not that the Hellcat was a wonder weapon, but that systematic training, proper doctrine, and industrial capacity, when combined, created a force multiplication effect that individual courage couldn't overcome. The Japanese Navy understood this. Intelligence documents captured after the war showed that senior commanders were acutely aware of the training crisis. They made desperate attempts to husband their remaining experienced pilots, to create new training programs, to somehow bridge the gap. But time had run out. The Philippines would fall. The home islands would be blockaded. And the last operational carriers would be reduced to decoys, their aircraft left ashore because there were no pilots capable of flying them. The shift to kamikaze tactics later in October was an explicit acknowledgement of this reality. If pilots couldn't be trained to conventional combat standards, if the kill ratios made conventional attacks unsustainable, then the only option was to use young men who knew barely more than how to take off and steer. Teach them to find American ships, teach them to dive. That was all they needed to know to deliver one bomb, once. It was a tactic born of desperation, not strength. And it said everything about how far Japanese naval aviation had fallen from the elite force that struck Pearl Harbor less than 3 years earlier. McCampbell stood on the Langley's flight deck, waiting for fuel trucks to arrive so he and Rushing could fly back to Essex. Around them, the battle for Leyte Gulf continued. To the north, American carriers were launching strikes against Japanese surface forces. To the south, Admiral Oldendorf's battleships were preparing to cross the T in Surigao Strait, fighting the last battleship engagement in naval history. And somewhere to the west, more Japanese aircraft were launching, more young pilots, climbing into obsolete fighters for missions they weren't trained to survive. 3 days later, October 27th, McCampbell's Hellcat sat on Essex's flight deck with 34 small Japanese flags painted on its fuselage, one for each confirmed kill. 34 victories in 6 months of combat, the third highest American ace total of the war, and the highest among pilots who survived to see victory. His Medal of Honor citation, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, would read, "Fighting desperately, but with superb skill against such overwhelming air power, he shot down 9 Japanese planes and, completely disorganizing the enemy group, forced the remainder to abandon the attack before a single aircraft could reach the fleet. Superb skill, but also superb training, superb tactics, superb equipment." The citation didn't mention those factors, but they were as essential to the victory as McCampbell's individual brilliance. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended on October 26th with a decisive American victory. The Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More than 12,000 Japanese sailors died. American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again operate as an effective fighting force. For the Japanese pilots who survived missions like the one McCampbell disrupted, the experience marked them permanently. Post-war interviews revealed the psychological impact of facing American fighters while knowing their training was inadequate, their aircraft inferior, their odds of survival minimal. Some spoke of feeling relief when they were shot down and survived, knowing they wouldn't have to fly another mission. Others described the growing certainty, as the war progressed, that they were being sent to die not in heroic combat but in futile gestures that would change nothing. American pilots, meanwhile, compiled statistics that seemed almost impossible. The F6F Hellcat accounted for 75% of all U.S. Navy aerial victories in the Pacific. More than 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed. 305 pilots achieved A status flying the Hellcat. The overall kill-to-loss ratio was 19-1. Against the Zero specifically, it was 13-1. These numbers reflected the accumulation of systematic advantages: better aircraft, better training, better tactics, better logistics, better industrial capacity. Any one of these factors alone might have been overcome, but all of them together created a disparity that no amount of traditional warrior spirit could bridge. McCampbell's 9 kills in one mission stood as a record, but it was representative of a larger pattern. American pilots regularly achieved ace-in-a-day status, 5 kills in a single mission. Some did it multiple times. The turkey shoots weren't anomalies. They were the predictable result of matching well-trained pilots in superior aircraft against poorly trained opponents flying obsolete designs. For Japan, the implications extended far beyond tactical defeats in individual battles. The collapse of their pilot training program meant that even if they designed better aircraft, which they did in the Ki-84 and other late-war fighters, they had no one capable of flying them effectively. The industrial base couldn't replace losses fast enough. The logistics system couldn't deliver fuel to training bases. And time, the most precious resource, had completely run out. Thanks for standing with us in this battle through history. Don't forget to hit subscribe and relive more untold stories on Fire and Steel.